Dustin Whitney, we had you on a podcast a few months back, and we ended that podcast talking about the potential situation where we have a negative economic growth model. Basically, we all know that we have an aging population, and North America, pretty much every Western nation on the planet or advanced economy on the planet has an aging economy, as well as a fertility rate well below replacement rate. I mean, South Korea has 0.7, Japan, Italy, etc. Most of Europe is somewhere around 1.4, when replacement fertility rate is 2.1. So what does a world look like where we have an aging population as well as a shrinking cohort of children? What does this look like economically? What does a world look like where instead of GDP increasing every year, GDP is actually shrinking?
Yeah, boy, what an interesting question. And I appreciate since I was on with you last, I've watched a couple of the other podcasts that you put out there, and you were trying to get Charles Goodhart to answer that question pretty significantly, right? I mean, you've got there an economist, obviously smart, well accomplished, been around the block a little bit for sure. I would have hoped that he would have had an answer for you that's probably better than I can. But it is an interesting question because economics, as far as I can understand it, and the bit of economics I've studied over the years, it always assumes a positive growth. It by definition, it's directionally positive. GDP, the basic formula of GDP would be labor times productivity, and if the labor is negative and the productivity is not making up for that negativity, then GDP has to be negative. And it's something that we just have never seen before. And my curiosity around it, really from my point of view, really from a businessman standpoint, right? I've looked for papers and studies and research associated with a shrinking economy from an economic model standpoint. I haven't found too much. There have been some papers written about the fact that ideas are kind of a generating from people, and when you have declining populations, then you might have declining ideas, which then can fuel reductions of innovation, and that certainly makes a lot of sense. And in the world of AI that we're in, and fueling of those ideas and productivity, that certainly could be there. But I guess the question really is, from an economic model point of view, what does a shrinking thing look like? And from a business point of view, right, everything is based on sales trends. A company's annual report has all sorts of analysis associated with a trajectory of their sales volumes, maybe markets they've opened, new products they've come out with that then fuel growth of volume, of revenue. And in times of reduction of those numbers in the business world, there's a tendency to look at it from more of a market share standpoint. So if the size of the business is going down, what share of the business do you have instead of how much are you growing? A good analogy for that would be like the U.S. car industry right now, right? The Detroit is having a hard time finding their way with this new world of electric vehicles, and they're losing all sorts of money. How do you judge their performance if the sales go down? And if a GDP of a country goes down, what does that look like? And what does it look like on a more macro scale? We really haven't seen it. Some stuff around world wars, right? World War I, World War II, certainly a lot of global disruption, and GDP of countries certainly went down, but it also just shifted a little bit, right? Instead of making televisions in America, we made ships, right, for wartime. So it is a good question. You've been going down the rabbit hole on this a little bit, Jesse. I've I like your curiosity. You keep pulling at it. Um, you've asked that question to a lot of different people. You've had several other authors on to talk about the topic. What's your point of view at this point?
In the last podcast that we had, with yourself, where you kind of brought this up at the end, and you're like, this will be a topic that will be, researched in the years to come. And so I was going into all the different various applications where you can pull up research articles, and you really don't find, first off, very few researchers even study this. And the fact is, in the research community, declining population, declining fertility is almost like taboo. So they don't want to talk about it. And then the ones that do, I was looking at a study, and I think they said, there's like 20 or maybe there's 19 countries that had a declining population, but they had an increase in GDP. But that is right now, where you can outsource, like Japan. Japan has been, even though Japan has a fertility rate of 1.2, they're able to offshore all their manufacturing. In an actual world where every country has a shrinking population, you're not able to offshore anything. So those models don't really hold true. And then the other studies that I saw are basically, well, you just give people more education, you have more ideas, you have a really educated workforce because you don't have to do any manual labor because the AI or the machines will do it. And therefore, even though you have less people, you have more ideas. Well, what are you going to do when you have 60% of your population in nursing homes or elderly, and the vast majority of the young workforce has to take care of them? I mean, what is that called? Like the dependency ratio? So, and I feel like the actual academics don't talk about the dependency ratio, and they don't talk about the ability to outsource the labor currently for these countries that have a declining population. So there's no one's studying this because we actually haven't experienced this for long enough to actually have any data.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. And that's a lot of where my curiosity on the topic comes from, because research is led by need, which is led by funding of sorts, and academics that get attached to certain types of conversations and topics. And it's something that if people aren't aware of it, then you've got a lack of interest out there, which then turns into lack of research in general. More than anything else, what I've tried to do in my work and through the book is to try to raise these questions to the surface, to grapple with these questions and get through it a little bit. Charles Goodhart had a great chapter in his book about Japan and the ability to offshore their labor. And that was definitely an unusual circumstance where their direct neighbors, the need for Japan was there, the resources for China was there, and they were able to manage through it in a pretty effective way. I guess to your point, Jesse, if the whole world is going through that, those luxuries aren't there, and maybe the resources from labor that can come from Africa would help fill some voids. But also, as you've pointed out in a couple other your podcasts and conversations, that's a whole challenging thing, right? You've got multiple countries, languages, policies. In theory, you've got there in Africa kind of the HR department of the world that could manifest itself, and then that labor could help offset the declines that we're seeing domestically. But from a GDP standpoint, as soon as the outlook looks more bleak, I think that's when you'll start to get some interest from more Wall Street type of economists and people along those lines that'll have some more interest in it. And you've asked the questions a lot of times, though, and I was kind of hoping to hear what you had to say from your interviews, because at this stage of the game, as far as I can see, you've talked to pretty much the portion of people out there that's written about the topic. Your conversation with Charles Goodhart there, their book probably most closely aligns with my interpretation of the topic. A little bit more from an academic side on their world, probably a little bit more from a real nuts and bolts business standpoint in my world. But the Venn diagram of our understandings are fairly similar, and I have a good amount of overlap. You were able to get in touch with him. I sent him an email a while back, and I wanted to chat with him a little bit, and it just didn't materialize into anything of sorts.
I've pretty much talked to like almost everyone on this topic. We actually just had Mads Larson. Do you know who he is?
I actually just started to listen to that earlier today, but he's got a different take on it, right?
Yeah, he's got a different take, but he's from Norway, which is also interesting because you get a different perspective from someone that lives in Europe, lives in one of the Nordic countries. But he got his PhD from UCLA, so he actually got his education in the United States. But one of the interesting things is basically no one knows what's going to happen because, like you've mentioned before, I mean, what is GDP? I mean, like, do you want to explain what GDP is?
Well, gross domestic product, right? That's what it stands for. And it's essentially a macro number of all output produced by a particular society. And it's all goods and services produced by all the labor involved. And if you study GDP levels, it has a tendency to take some pretty big leaps over time. Classic example would be the Industrial Revolution right after World War I. Major gains in productivity, and then fueled after the World War II and the baby boom itself, kind of another big jolt into the side of it. And that's basically the total output of a society, of a country. That's a bit of a difficult thing for you to really kind of understand, right? It's the total output of everything in a certain country. A lot of different outputs there. I have a tendency to look at things like that as a little bit more isolated to, say, a company or a product line or an industry, and it makes it a little bit easier to understand and comprehend. The things like automobiles, right? You look at right now all the automobiles made in Europe, they're declining in quantity, and they used to judge that and compare that against the automobiles produced in Detroit. And then, of course, the Toyotas and Nissans of the world started to impact things in the late 70s, early 80s. And at least when you look at something a little bit more finite, you can appreciate what it means. And it's at that point, number of cars produced, all the revenue generated, and of course, all the inputs of labor around it. So GDP equals productivity times the labor of it. And if productivity goes up, GDP has a tendency to make some pretty big gains. And I suppose if you had enough people in the conversation, you could really have some dialogue around the potential impacts of AI and what kind of productivity gains can be realized through artificial intelligence. And I think that's probably quite promising. Different parts of the world will harness that in different ways, though.
Yeah, I guess that was kind of what I was getting at where my last question was just when you're talking about labor, you're essentially talking about the number of workers. So as the workforce ages out into retirement, not only are those say boomers, which is the vast majority of these retirees, not only are they not working, but they're actually they're drawing on their Social Security or other pensions, right? So instead of putting into the system, they're taking out of the system, and then we have a decreasing fertility. So then we have less people working to actually put into the system, and then people somehow, the only way to balance this equation with less workers with more retirees is with some type of technological change. People are saying, AI, but there's a massive difference between Chat GPT and some of the other AI tools and some sentient robot that's running around changing diapers and fixing automobiles and being a plumber or something like that. People are vastly over exaggerating the ability of AI to replace fully functioning human beings.
Yeah, no doubt about that. I agree with you entirely about that. Uh, just like anything else, though, it's a tool, and the tool can be maximized in a lot of different ways. But in order to do so, there have to be some really big changes to the way products, services are performed today. When your analogy there, your conversation associated with production and consumption is really a good thing to kind of hover on. Think about a home builder, right? You're a large company producing homes in America. You're kind of getting at they're going to be getting hurt on both sides of the equation. They're going to have a challenge producing homes, building them, because it's heavily labor induced, and then the market opportunity to sell the homes is going to go down as well, because there's going to be fewer customers. So you're going to have fewer people to help build the homes and fewer customers to actually buy the homes. I know you asked that a little bit of Charles Goodhart, and he was kind of saying, well, total population is actually continuing to grow and develop, and he is correct there. However, the mismatch of the use case, and a very large home that has a high degree of maintenance associated with it, to an older person, 3 flights of stairs, that kind of thing, a wide bathroom kind of thing, there would be definitely a mismatch. And so a company like a home builder would need to really approach their model much differently. And that's probably where machines can help, right? Fabrication of homes or home structures, whether it's made in a factory environment and brought to site, 3D printed on site, that kind of thing. There's probably some potential gains there.
Can we speculate then that if GDP and productivity goes down, that our standard of living will go down with it? Like price of goods go up, we'll have to pile ourselves in a home, like many families living in the same house. There's less work. Is that, can that possibly happen where it's just like, our standard of living starts to decline?
Yeah, wouldn't it be interesting if people started talking about that, right? And I think, Jesse, you mentioned that a little bit in your conversation with Charles Goodhart. You were kind of looking at the difference of ages between you and him, right? And your general outlook, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but basically it's a pretty good time to be alive, right? Generally speaking, we have a lot of things available to us as modern societies that certainly generations ago didn't have. Time, luxury, the ability to decide what you want to do, when you want to do it, the sheer ability to actually work, an 8-hour day of job instead of a 14 or 15-hour a day job, having that time to read books and exchange in leisure activities. There's no doubt that with the reduction of overall population size and GDP, those luxuries, those conveniences really can certainly erode. And I guess it wouldn't be all that surprising if we almost had a reversal of all that modern convenience and luxury, go back to what it once was, maybe in the 20s or 30s, something like that.
Yeah, I was going to follow that up with, do we go simpler? Like, do people start moving out of cities and live simpler like we did back in the day? I wonder if there's a world where that could happen.
Probably depends a little bit on the society and the desire of that society. You see some things happening in Europe right now, which is definitely going in that path. So people are taking a simpler direction on certain things. Other more advanced societies might try to handle it differently. Try to plow through the technology and see if they can gain some ground that way. There's no doubt, though, that our lives as we experience them today is definitely going to evolve and change, and there'll be some upward opportunity in a lot of places like Africa that will have an opportunity to advance in their economy. but more modern Western places like America and in Western Europe will probably have some declines in that kind of convenience and quality of life.
For me, I think one of the big things that we're talking about, like kind of like this negative growth model, is, when Social Security first came out in the 1930s, which, Social Security is the biggest percentage of the federal spending, is somewhere around 25% or a quarter. We recently did a podcast with the whole Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency, and we were kind of discussing, but it's like somewhere around 85 cents on the dollar of federal spending are in these like entitlement programs, like I shouldn't say defense, but entitlement programs like Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, and then you have the interest on the debt and the defense spending. So it's really kind of hard to, like, how are you going to kind of shave a lot of this stuff off? But if we have all these retirees, so, back in the 1930s when we had Social Security initially implemented, you had life expectancy of like 60, yet the retirement age was like 65. So if we even just like pegged retirement to, the retirement age to whatever, right now it'd be like in the 80s, right? Or what's the life expectancy? I guess maybe like the late 70s. So you have very few people drawing out. So Social Security was never designed to be lived on for like 25 years. And that's, a whole issue. You can talk about, social issues, but in terms of like just the budgeting, right now, 25% of the budget goes to Social Security. So if we have less workers paying into it, how are we going to possibly pay for all these retirees in a shrinking GDP? That doesn't include anything else. Again, the healthcare costs have gotten, insane. I mean, I think in 1982, when Reagan was president, Medicare was like 7% of the budget. Now Medicare, Medicaid is 20% of the budget. So just between Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, we're at 45% of the budget. Like, we haven't even done it. We're almost at half the budget. And every year that's going to be even bigger, right? I mean, every day we have 10 to 11,000 boomers retiring. So every day that number gets even bigger. And then every day we have less children being born than we did years ago. How do we balance all this out? I guess this is the question.
Yeah. Hard questions, right? And I think there's a couple approaches to the topic. One is that certainly for all my adult life, the conversations around Social Security have been around. And I even remember 15, 20 years ago having some conversations of that if somebody were to give me personally an opportunity to not pay into the system anymore, be able to keep all my own earnings and give up everything I've already paid into it, I certainly would have taken that opportunity. Politicians obviously don't want to talk about that. You've got younger people that don't really appreciate the hardship that can happen when those numbers really start to hit at full stride. And of course, then you've got such a major portion of the population that that are going to be that already are quite dependent on those resources. In the end, you've got to balance it out by either distributing less or paying in more per person, or perhaps a combination of the two. I guess the bigger and more broad conversation that's more along my interest is that we're not even having these conversations. They get sound bites on the news, the Sunday talk shows and stuff like that, but there's no practical conversation associated with the way to fundamentally pay for and support those kinds of programs. The business community has an opportunity to do so in a more matter of fact way. It doesn't involve as much personal lives and situations as it does. You got more fundamental conversations associated with, you got to close a plant because it's not productive or profitable. You got to move on from a certain product line, and those kinds of radical decisions can be made but apparently in government circles, it's very difficult to do. Another thing to consider when you are talking about the negative GDP is the fact that this is really a global conversation, and certain countries are experiencing these topics at different rates, but there's a trend that's unmistakable and very consistent across the entire world. And there's going to be a shakeout there. You're going to have societies that are going to handle it in certain ways. And you can see already China, for example, they're going to start trying to bolster their voids and their vacuum by more government spending. Some people are suggesting more is necessary or whatnot, but someplace like China, they've been on a building spree of building homes for 20 years. They now have way too many homes for the people. And of course, there's a plummeting of value of those homes, and a major sector of their economy is wounded because of that. You got other countries that will try to tackle it from policy standpoint, right? And try to spur on more fertility, more babies. And there's not a whole lot of success in times past with that, but when circumstances are more dire, then that could be. And then, of course, you got immigration. The immigration. In my book, I talk about the fact that it might be a potential solution, but it's a first mover advantage at best, because eventually there's just going to be major competition shown for immigrants, and the people chasing after the people, and eventually you're going to run into the fact that people are going to be drying up because there's not enough people to be moving around in the different parts of the world.
I must say, like, ever since I was a teenager, I've just heard that overpopulation was a problem. Overpopulation was bad for the environment. And I can't help but think if this sort of enabled our thinking, in that we didn't think about multiplication and, replacing ourselves as important as it is sort of this whole environmental movement. And I've never really heard of this problem myself until recently, because I've only heard population is the enemy, right? The humanity is the enemy, and it's going to kill planet Earth. And so I think there has to be a shift in narrative in that culture. And it's almost like make families or having a nuclear family and make reproduction like cool again, I feel, because it's uncool right now to the young people. I mean, I said this on the last podcast that I didn't make it a priority. Like, the family just was not a priority for me. And now, I'm early 40s, and probably too late for me to have a child. I do work, insane amount of hours a week. I just don't see it economically for us. Maybe we'll adopt later on, but that I didn't participate. I didn't replace myself, essentially. You've been saying that this is a really important conversation, but I think it rooted from an older conversation that making babies was a bad thing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's probably 2, 3, maybe even 4 different derivatives of that dialogue. There's no doubt that the narrative of exploding population and destroying the planet, that goes way back. Certainly talk a lot about that in my book. More modern, though, is this general belief that it's actually bad to have children. And I have 3 children myself, and they're not really old enough to approach that, but they're just about there. So my kids are 21, 19, and 17 right now. And as the person who wrote the book that I have, a couple of my kids have looked at me like, "Really, Dad? You're going to tell us to have kids?" And that's a hard conversation, because it's a choice, right? But there are serious implications of not having enough young people. And I'm not going to suggest that everybody should be producing babies. I think that's largely a policy position that I just don't like to take. Rather, what I like to try to do is bring things to the surface and understand the implications of it. And if you think about it, think about what we experienced as a society in the early onset of COVID. And there was a good period of time there where we really lost a lot of our modern conveniences. And they varied in form and fashion. Sometimes there were mild frustrations, and sometimes there were direct impediments to existence. You think about just the mild frustration sides of it. Limited hours of availability of stuff, right? Restaurants or lack of groceries on the shelves of the grocery stores. Your inability to replace your refrigerator if it broke because the supply chain was 6 months in arrears. Those inconveniences are going to start to happen more and more. And that's kind of the reason for why I've chosen to commit to the topic and write my book and explore the different things that I have, so that we can drive those kinds of things to the surface and really start having informed dialogue and informed conversation, because it's a thing. And Jesse, you asked that of Charles Goodhart at the end of your podcast. You asked him, is this good? Because of all the reactions you've got from your different comments of your podcast. And when people asked me that, I said, well, I'm not quite sure if it's good or bad, but it's a really big thing. And it's going to have a variety of different implications. So I think that if we're going to have a change of opinions of that narrative, Kai, we're probably going to have to start experiencing some of those challenges associated with it, right? So instead of having a job to go to, or a career to pursue, or a leisurely activity to enjoy, somebody's going to have to take care of their aging parent because they can't find a nurse to help with their daily duties. They can't find the assistance, or perhaps it's just too expensive and out of reach. So people are going to start to realize that even though they don't have children themselves, there's an implication of the cause and the effect there, that it's going to impact everybody, for sure.
I always ask that question when we talk about this topic, like, what are the benefits, kind of what are the drawbacks of this kind of shrinking population, or eventually shrinking population? And if you talk to just like someone in a bar or in a restaurant, they're always like, humanity sucks, like less people is better, blah, blah, blah. But then it's like, okay, well, your parents are drawing Social Security. Well, maybe they won't be drawing Social Security, or there'll be a reduction because there's less workers paying in. Maybe our taxes will go up because all of a sudden now the wastewater treatment plants, and we have too many schools, so they got to shut down schools. But it's like, you can't just rip out half the pipes out of a city. Be like, okay, well, we're just going to rip out half these pipes. We don't need this water. Like, it doesn't work that way, right? Like, if you don't maintain the sewage and the wastewater treatment plants and the electricity lines and all these things, like, what's going to happen? And like, and like you see houses like in Japan where it's like you buy a house, it loses a bunch of its value like a car does in the USA, because like, why would a house hold value when the population is decreasing? So you build a house and then you go to sell it and you lose money on the house. Like, there's so many negatives. All you have to do is look at something like Detroit. But I think the whole Detroit or Rust Belt example is so old that most people don't even, when you say Rust Belt, they probably don't even know what that means.
Yeah. And that's, going back to the whole concept of a negative GDP, and everything has been dependent. The economic model, as it's understood, is dependent on a fundamental platform of growth. And what you're bringing up there is the need to fundamentally reconsider those positions. Think about the house concept, right? The whole idea of the American dream: have a job that you can get through and enjoy for 20 years. You buy a house, you pay it off over time with a mortgage. maybe put a white picket fence in front of it, and you've got yourself a nice little life. It's all predicated, though, on the general assumption that that asset will have forward value. It's going to be worth more tomorrow than it is today. And a declining economy, a shrinking economy, does not have those assumptions. You just can't. It's like trying to catch a falling knife. And if you're still in the real estate business and speculation of long-term asset value and over the course of 50 or 80 years, you're not paying attention to the right things. The other thing about these general trends that people have a tendency to just kind of glance across is there's this perceived notion that this is going to happen at some point in the future over time, right? Well, we're going to be better off because we'll have fewer people. And perhaps if there was a trajectory, if the timeline was such that population were going to decline, say, slowly and consistently over a length of time, that it could be absorbed, say, over 100 years or something like that. That's a whole different equation than what we're experiencing right now. And my particular area of interest is a little bit more accelerated than I think most of your guests have been, because what got me curious in the topic to begin with was the fundamental flaw in the modeling itself of the population projections. And Charles Goodhart was pretty consistent in the analysis of his numbers. The general idea, though, is according to demographers, and this is a relatively modern thought process that has not truly been proven out, but the general idea is that after a decline of fertility, there'll be a stabilization of it. It'll stabilize, and most models have that stabilizing around 2.1, the replacement. So the population projections that have been utilized over the last 20, 25 years, whether it's driven by the UN or US Census Bureau or a couple of the European operations that produce the numbers too, they have this general assumption that fertility is going to rebound. And so, Kai, everything you just described directly is against all of that, right? I mean, are you seeing any indications at all to suggest that people are going to start having children in the way they did in the 50s, right? There's none of that kind of suggestion out there, yet demographers model it that way. And it really was just almost 11 months or so ago, the US Census Bureau changed their outlook on fertility to a little bit more of a reasonable and realistic standpoint, but they're still projecting too high. The number is still continuing to trend down. And if you look at the outlook, for example, that the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics says, it disagrees with those numbers. So there's just a misunderstanding of what's really going on with the rate of the number change. And Charles Goodhart actually said it a couple of times in your podcast, saying, the labor force, the working age population in America is going to continue to grow, just grow slower. And that might be what the Bureau of Labor Statistics is saying, but now the Census Bureau is saying something different. And the reality is, look at a chart. It's already plateaued and it's starting to erode. There are a couple of little nip and tuck things associated with COVID and some adjustments, but essentially the working age population in America has already stalled and declining. And Jesse, to your point of areas like Detroit, there's always a convenient explanation for something, right? So look at just Detroit, look at the Rust Belt. I said, well, yeah, who wants to live in Detroit? That would be something somebody would say. Or who wants to go through the hassle of having children, They're easy answers. They're not very interesting answers, though, because if you look at, county level population in America, the vast majority of counties in America have lost population, not gained. And so you can't just simply say, oh, nobody wants to live in Detroit, because the same thing can be said about any number of different places in America. And you can't say that every place is not a good place to live.
So I guess what I'm hearing is, before people really start having the serious conversation about this, is you almost have to feel the pain first, where Plumbers cost too much, so you're just patching it up yourself because you can't afford a plumber. It's almost like we have to feel the pain to find a solution. Would you say?
Yeah, that's an unfortunate, probably a good way to put it.
Mm.
And I guess part of my task and our tasks collectively are to kind of drive the topic to the surface a little bit more, so that that pain level doesn't have to be too hard, too harsh, because you can see where all of a sudden you're in a predicament, and then somebody says, "Oh, so that's what they were talking about." Well, that's too late, right? You've got to make sure you have the proper opportunity to plan and handle those changes. And so the plumbing example is a pretty good one. And that's not to say that all things are going to be easily solved without a plumber. But if you think about it, there's certain aspects of say plumbing or those kinds of fix-its that can be largely helped without a plumber itself. It doesn't mean that you get, if all your pipes are broken in your house, you can't just rip out walls and replace pipes if you're not trained enough to do so. But I tell you, last week I was at MIT, and I judged an AI competition at the MIT Media Lab. What an impressive operation! I always get awed when I walk into those walls. There was actually a DIY application that some students were working on to specifically address the lack of plumbers, and it was remarkably helpful. And it's not necessarily going to fix and replace a plumber, but there might be 30 or 40% of the stuff that you would call a plumber for that maybe you could handle in a different way. And those kinds of solutions are going to be needed if we can get through it. You got to have a plumber, right? You can't just have water backing up in your house.
We're talking about this specific example of a plumber, and I have a buddy of mine who's a licensed plumber. In the state that he's in, he had to get another licensed plumber, certified plumber, whatever terminology what we want to use, to sign off on it. And the question is, well, why would another plumber sign off on this other plumber's certification? Because now he's just adding competition to the community or to his area. And then if they do sign off on it, it's like, well, you're going to have to work for us for a couple of years, get some experience, and then we'll sign off on this license. And a lot of states, California, et cetera, are really heavily regulated. So do you have to have, if we, first off, the fact that we have a sentient robot is going to be really far off. But even if we did, does that sentient robot then have to go to some plumber certification and sit down with everyone else, and he's gonna have to demonstrate their skills? And then how much does this plumber robot weigh? This plumber robot is 2,000 pounds. Is it going up a flight of stairs and then crashing through the ceiling? Or is it going under the, going under your kitchen sink and ripping off the door handle because it's so powerful? For the people that think these things are real, I'm like, okay, this might be real in the year 2500. I don't know what the hell you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, look, that's a continuing with the plumber example. It's very interesting conversation, and you're right. If you do more damage, you rip through the wall, you're going to have a carpenter robot that's going to do the other thing, right? Or the carpenter robot will then destroy the plumbing that you just put in. But you're right. So a couple of things though to kind of consider is that the bureaucracy associated with something like that, right? That's been largely built up over time, and regardless of where you fall in political spectrums and conversations associated with all sorts of government bureaucracy and rules and regulations. Keep in mind that if we have a shortage of plumbers, we have a shortage of plumbing inspectors, we have a shortage of plumber teachers, we have a shortage of plumbing supply house guys. So, signing off on that authorization, is that going to be as important as stopping the water from running through your house? Probably not, right? So you'll have patchworks of things, and you're already starting to see some of these things across the country, at least in America. So middle part of the country, different sectors, different industries have shortages of labor that are pretty pronounced. Truckers, for example, right? Many states have already allowed, they've changed the rules and regulations to allow for younger people to be a trucker, right? So I think for the most part, to get your CDL driver's license, I think you've needed to be 21 years of age. And in a lot of places, that's been reduced to 18. Now, I got to tell you, I have 3 kids, and I've taught them all how to drive. I've yet to meet an 18-year-old that I want driving a rig. That's for sure. But the point is that the deregulation goes hand in hand. If you got a truck that needs to be driven, somebody's there with their hand up saying, "Yeah, I'll drive it." Who's going to say no? Those kinds of things will have a natural tendency to happen. So little by little, peeling away those layers of regulation, it's going to have to happen. That's also kind of an example of how different countries across the world could handle different things, right? Obviously, we're pretty regulated here in America. Different parts of the world don't have as many regulations. Something like flying autonomous vehicles, probably going to happen, at least for ubiquitous nature outside of America. Way too many lawyers are going to sue and complain that something fell or crashed into something. But there'll be other parts of the world that'll fully embrace and change. And that's the cause and effect of different things, right? So somebody's going to wake up and says, well, they got it over there. Why can't we use it?
I agree with that 100%. By the way, I really I think that some of these regulations will just fall off. If really no one can do it, someone has to step up and do it. And I would rather have someone come in, like trial and error, learn how to do certain things, like allow them to learn, allow them to just make the mistakes, and that's sort of like the pain we'll feel, if you will. But it does kind of feel like we're going to go back to where we had younger people knowing how to build a home. Like, we're going to go back to these sort of traditional, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of, I lost the word. Sorry. I was looking for, but building homes, like, less like computer work, but really
They want manual labor? Or?
Manual. Well, yeah. If like your table breaks, you learn how to fix it.
It's like carpentry?
There's a word. I forgot the word. I apologize, but I just feel like I would learn how to go fix my own plumbing if I know I couldn't afford. You know what I mean? It would force me to go figure it out.
In these kinds of conversations, there's also the likelihood to just think about it in such a dramatic fashion, right? So Jesse, the way you're describing a robot, right? That's in today's robotic world, and you're right. But the rate of change is going to be conducive and consistent with the rate of need, because the marketplace will help that along if need be. So if there's a requirement, if there's a market need for something, then somebody's going to figure out a way to make it, because at least in America, at least in the capitalistic environment, that's where success goes to. And further, it's not just going to be marginal changes to things. It's going to be big reversals of things, right? So you're going to have a complete area of sectors of industry that are not going to be utilized like they were before, right? Think about daycare centers versus nursing homes, right? I mean, to a certain degree, it's a similar function, right? And the market need is going to be much more so on the nursing home side than there is going to be on daycare centers. In fact, it already is. And in different parts of the country, you start to see that in different ways. So these small little changes over time will really be the indications of stuff. And then all of a sudden, you'll have something relatively ubiquitous. That's kind of roaming around your house and helping you out as a helping hand. You know, maybe not quite as rosy Jetsons was, but something similar in that direction for sure.
We've heard of the great wealth transfer, and they're basically saying that the boomer generation, which is something around 1/3 of all households, but holds over 50% of all the wealth. And then when you combine the boomer generation with the silent generation, that there's somewhere around $65 trillion of transferable assets. Most of that will be passed down once they pass away within the next 20 years, so to about 2045, to kind of millennials, Gen Z, and a little bit to Gen X, but mostly to millennials. So how does this change the housing market? How does this change other assets such as the stock market? What are going to be the repercussions of the $65 trillion transfer in the next 20 years?
Yeah, so let's just kind of revisit that whole thought, though, because what you're suggesting is that there's a pile of money that's been saved up over time by the largest population size of our economy. And that's true, right? They've saved a lot, and there's a lot of them. The general assumption, though, of that money just going to being passed down, I think is an area where you got to need to reconsider a little bit, because older populations are going to have more degrees of health issues like Alzheimer's, right? And Alzheimer's is not very deadly. It takes a long time for people to pass from Alzheimer's, and in fact, it oftentimes takes a good amount of time and a lot of patience, obviously, but a lot of money, because there's a series of different things that happen as a result of somebody becoming forgetful in their mind. They need to be taken care of, and they might live for another 6, 7, 8, 9 years, but then they got to be taken care of. Well, being taken care of is awfully expensive, so a lot of that money that's saved up, it's going to have to get depleted. I guess if there's more further conversation associated with end of life situations, the topic of assisted suicide kind of thing, or something like that. But it's going to cost a whole lot of money for all those people to continue to live, and that wealth transfer doesn't happen until they pass. So my suggestion would be that pile of money is probably going to be a whole lot smaller than a lot of people are expecting it to be. And even more so when you think about the compounding impact of healthcare today is going to be more expensive tomorrow, right? You're going to have those labor shortages, those other components in there that are going to continue to drive costs up. The need for healthcare is only going to be increasing, not going down. So unless there's huge amounts of innovation brought to the table that drives those costs down, it's going to be a double whammy impact of not just is it going to be taking a lot longer and people are going to require more expense to continue to live, but it's going to be more expensive in and of itself. So the asset appreciation part of your question, I think, is a really interesting one, and something that I think it's going to catch a lot of people by surprise, and hopefully, as you mentioned, Kai, not so far that it's too painful, because there's an enormous amount of importance put on that long-term asset appreciation. It's arguably the most important thing societal has, is the ability to gather assets and to realize gain on those assets. To the housing thing, what happens to a house value when there's 3 houses for every 2 people that need it? And some people might say, well, I want this type of house versus that kind of house. If it's less expensive, and people will probably have a tendency to move and be able to trade down. I think those parts of the economy are probably going to be more impacted than certainly people are expecting. Stock market, equities, again, going back to the academic side of forward projecting. I mean, the whole concept of the stock is that it's worth more over time, right? That's all the Wall Street people say, take your money, put it in there, and just keep it there. Don't try to time the market. Don't try to just take a diversified approach, have a little bit in a lot of different places. And over the course of time, it's going to be worth more money. Well, what if it isn't? You're just putting bad money after bad money.
Yeah. By the way, that's the first time we're hearing that. Like, what if it doesn't grow the 8% annually? That might change. And I think that not a lot of people, I mean, including myself, because I'm just hearing about this, that might be a possibility, that we can invest all this money and it's worth less when we retire. And so it's like, what solutions do we have here? I guess it's like,
well, I more important than anything else is the awareness and understanding of the topic in its whole, right? Understand what's going on around you. There can be different interpretations of things. When I started looking at this topic 8 years or so ago, and I started chatting with some people about it, they thought I was crazy, right? I mean, let alone getting a shoe thrown at me because I was suggesting that we need more people in this world, right? But in a relatively short period of time, over the last 8 years or so that I've been studying the topic, opinions have changed a little bit. There are definitely some conversations happening now that weren't happening then, and maybe it'll happen a little bit further down the road. It would be really helpful if a lot of smart people were to start talking about it, right? And so putting all your money into the concept of a long-term equity, I guess a lot of those Wall Street people probably wouldn't like to hear me say that. However, if they actually convened a conference about it and discussed it, they'd probably come out of that conference with a different opinion that they went into it, regardless if they were changed their opinion on it or not. I think I'm a big believer in the marketplace, the model of capitalism. And I do believe that as issues come up, as problems happen, as opportunities arise, the market will produce a solution or an opportunity associated with it. And that's certainly nothing new. We've gone through a lot of stuff over time. Human beings have been challenged in a lot of ways, and something is going to happen. Hopefully I'll be around to see what happens. But the way I'm looking at it is there's 2 or 3 time periods of disruption. My particular area of focus is a little bit on the shorter end than a lot of the other people out there, especially that you've had on your podcast. I'm interested, say, between now and 2035. 2020 to 2035 really has been the 15-year window of time that is particularly interesting to me. And I think as we get closer to 2030, the popping activity of marketplace stuff is going to start to pick up speed. 2035 or so will be a whole bunch of stuff going on, changes, businesses opening and closing, and sacrifices and successes and all that. And then I'd say between 2035 and 2050, there'll be a period of emerging of different stuff, and the marketplace will kind of find an equilibrium. And at 2050 or so, I think that's probably what's going to ride for the next 50 years or so. Technology advancements are obviously a big part of that timeline. But that's the time of major disruption, and then the marketplace reacting to that disruption, and then finding some sort of natural equilibrium. That's one of the things that I'm particularly focused on.
no, that's really interesting. So you're saying we're technically in it now?
No doubt about it.
Yeah. So if you were, okay, let's say you're, 30s and 40s, and you sort of want to be able to navigate this up until that, 2050, what do you reckon if putting your money in the stock market isn't really as safe as, we would say now, because of this, kind of looming issue? what do you do? What would you then suggest? Like, do you then start buying businesses from retiring boomers? Do you then take over, keep it going, learn new skill? Where do you park your money? Where do you invest at this point?
Yeah. Well, if I really do those answers to those questions, I probably wouldn't be talking to you guys. I'd be on a big boat someplace in some ocean. So I'm not going to suggest that I can advise people on what to do with their money. However, from a common business standpoint, I think it's important not to overreact and not to do anything that is particularly unreasonable, right? So taking all your money out of the stock market and putting it onto your mattress is probably not something I would suggest, right? However, being aware of certain things is definitely a high degree. If you're 35 years old and you're approaching the conversation of maybe I should buy a house or take a leap or something like that, right? The numbers have to work, and they have to work in order for a particular budget to be balanced. Don't buy a house at 35 years old specifically so that you can live off of that earnings after 35 years and sell your house and retire on it. It's probably not that worthy of a consideration. And you just think about that, right? I'm talking about reevaluating long-term asset appreciation. I mean, my gosh, there's a whole bunch of financial experts out there that'll not like what I'm saying, but the fundamentals they're there. At least have a conversation about it, and then think about what is it that is important for those inputs to actually produce some sort of benefit, and are those inputs actually there? On a career path, I do a lot of different things with emerging leaders and developing of labor force and skills. If you look at the major universities across the United States, they're slow to react and very very naive on some of these things. I would put a lot more focus on critical thinking and not necessarily producing for any certain career path per se, but man, oh man, between AI and robotics, a whole lot of stuff is going to change. So think about what it is that you can do that has value, and certainly the human brain is still pretty powerful. So you think about it that way. Don't get overly committed to some one way or the other. Mix in some humility, and maybe you got some thinking going on there.
Kind of going back to the housing question. Basically boomers and the silent generation, the silent generation is older than the boomers, but they own somewhere around 50% of all the houses in the United States of America. And at the very youngest, the boomers around, are older than 60 years old. So if half the housing stock is owned by these people 60 plus years old and they start dying off in the next 20 years, all of a sudden, are we going to be flooded? The housing market's going to be flooded with these houses. And then secondly, we don't have as many children being born. So we have less families, less kind of need for the housing. So does that just mean at some point we're going to get to the point, like right now we have a housing shortage, but are we kind of tipping where we're going to have a housing surplus? And then every year we're going to have a bigger gap between the people that need a house and there's just so many houses hitting the market?
Yeah, I'll take odds that we're probably not in as much of a housing shortage in the country as of right now that most people think, and for a lot of those general reasons why you just kind of went through it a little bit. And as far as a glut of supply, your timeline there of say 20 years makes reasonable sense considering what's going on, right? Boomers are aging and whatnot. I would suggest to you, though, this conversation would be very different in a short period of time. I'd say probably the next 18 to 36 months. As soon as there's an economic opportunity to be realized, I think a lot of those houses will be vacated. I think there's a lot of people sitting on those homes that the homes are either paid off or or mortgaged with very low interest rate, and the carrying cost of the house is not overly difficult. As soon as an opportunity arises for that to be realized as a gain, I think you'll start to see that. I think you'll start to see it in certain parts of the country more than others. So from a general trend standpoint, I think you're spot on. And I'd suggest it's probably going to happen a lot sooner than you think.
Do you think that the government will eventually continue to incentivize having more children, like more tax incentives, if you will?
Public policy, right now, I think the policy in America around that topic has more to do with the affordability aspect of having children. And so in that regard, I think there's kind of a play for the politicians to pander to voters and to say, hey, I'm going to make your life better. I'm going to give you more of a discount. I'm going to give you more of a benefit from a tax standpoint. It's definitely not, public policy in America, at least now, is definitely not trying to change fertility trends. Other parts of the world have definitely experienced that, gone through it. A lot of countries are trying to do that right now. I don't think it'll be too long till that conversation starts here in America. And I'm not a politician, so I really can't say what interpretations would be. But a whole lot would have to change for the American policy to be natalist, to be pro-natalist, to try to boost fertility. All those thoughts that you described a couple of minutes ago would have to be very, very different, right? All the advocacy groups, all the environmentalists, all the sociology people,
The feminists
would have to.
Yeah.
A lot of people would have to change their minds and interpretation, and that certainly can happen. But I don't necessarily see that happening anytime soon. I probably see other countries trying to do it more so, and the results of that effort probably being a little bit more demonstrable and be able to understood. There's just so many great examples of what's going on across the country and the world to point to and say, well, okay, they're trying it. There's the result. And you'll have advocacy groups saying a lot of different things, but sculpting policy in America seems, considering the election we just had and stuff, it seems a whole lot of people are in different places in their thought process.
Yeah.
Let's just put on our investor hat on for a second, right? So you're saying you're looking at what up to about the year 2035 or so. And so we're not really necessarily, at least in the US, dealing with a population decline. We're more or less dealing with aging population. And I had, Daryl Burker on, and he was talking about, as an investor, like, why would you focus on, like getting kids when there's just that many of them? Why don't you focus on, as an investor, older people, because there's a bunch of them. And so the timeline we're looking at, say the next 10, 15 years, whatever, the boomers are still going to be around. They're going to be older, but isn't it right now? Isn't there more people age 65 and older than age 5 and younger? And every year that gap kind of gets wider. So if we're putting our investor hat on, what's the whole expression? Never let a crisis go to waste. So what is the opportunities for people that are thinking about, hey, let's try to invest some money. Let's try to take advantage of this. How can we, help society with businesses, entrepreneurship, etc.?
Well, I think it makes a lot of sense to look at the market need versus the opportunities of products and services. The whole adage of understanding where the hockey puck is going to, and that's where you want to skate to, right? You don't want to necessarily skate and follow the hockey puck. You want to go and follow where it's going to go, and that's where you want to be. Certain basics there are easily understood, right? To your point of kids, the marketplace of children versus marketplace of older people are dramatically different than they were just as recently as 15 or 20 years ago. So products and services geared towards children, if you're in that business and in that sector, you need to probably think about it in ways that the marketplace will have a need for. And so maybe it's helping parents through challenging situations because their time and resources are spread even more thin, right? Intuitive tutors or opportunities to help move kids around, the stuff that takes a lot of time and effort for parents. As investors, right, start by thinking of where is the problem and staying away from the problem, right? Just don't go and buying real estate investment trusts and start building for the future unless part of the model might be retooling and reusing. Right? If you got some sort of company out there or expertise that's developed in conversion of stuff, offices to residential buildings to medical facilities, anything along those lines. Really, the biggest thing I think I could try to suggest towards investors is reconsider what are the fundamental principles you're guiding on right now, and just take a good hard look and say, in the future, are those fundamentals still going to be there? And if they are, then continue down that path. If they aren't, then you really need to think about things in a little different fashion. As I'm talking to different businesses and opportunities associated with this topic of how to handle things and what to do over the next 15 years or so, you got to reevaluate. You got to ask yourself, what business am I in? What business should I be in? And what business will I ultimately have to be in order to be successful at some point down the road? And if you're honest with yourselves, you're probably going to realize that those conversations are different now than they were at some point relatively in recent times. Certainly for family-owned businesses and stuff like that, you've got to think down the road a little bit more.
Talking about family-owned businesses, I was kind of reading some articles recently that was saying, and you kind of see maybe this stuff on Instagram where it's like, buy a boring business from a boomer as they're, aging out and retiring. But basically what I heard was that there was almost $10 trillion worth of these quote unquote boring businesses from boomers, and there was like 2.5 million of them. But then I was also reading that you had, let's just say hypothetically, you had like a Porta-John company. So then you'd have private equity that was going into the area and buying every Porta-John company. And we'll just say hypothetically, it's like Asheville, North Carolina. So they'd be buying Porta-John companies in Asheville and Hendersonville and, on Arden or whatever, like all the surrounding areas. And then they would turn it into like this one, kind of giant company. So if you were going, where people think it's like, oh, maybe it's a smart move, but then all of a sudden now you're competing with the private equity firm. It seems like, I don't know, you really can't, believe Instagram, but it seems like it's not necessarily good. I was thinking maybe you like talk to the person that owns the private John company, and instead of, buying the company for $2 million, you just contact all the customers and just start your own Porta-John company in this hypothetical situation, and then try to undercut the competition instead of competing with the private equity. But is it actually true? Is private equity coming in and buying these companies? Same thing with the housing market, right? As these boomers are aging out and they're, BlackRock, and you hear, Blackstone, et cetera, is just buying all these houses. I mean, is this true? Like, is it even, attainable for the average person to even buy one of these businesses or homes that are actually hitting the market?
Well, private equity people, they see opportunity in whatever model they're looking at, right? And so your example you just described of the Porta-Johns, right? In that instance, the scalability then becomes quite powerful, right? So you gather up all the Porta-Johns, and by virtue of definition, you've got most of the market share. Your costs to operate that are lower because you've got a lot of them, and your margins are probably fattening up. However, don't look past the basics of thinking, are those Porta-Johns needed, right? And, I don't know the Porta-John business in Asheville, North Carolina. So, but the demonstration is a good one. I think when you look at all those private equity firms that have bought up all the real estate, well, that's where the marketplace opportunity has been, right? So, going through that hypothetical we just spoke about a couple of minutes ago, if there happens to be a rush to market of a lot of those homes that are owned and they come to the market for value, what do you think those private equity guys are going to do? They're not going to gobble them up. They're going to sell off the ones they have, and they're going to try to do it sooner and cut their losses and lock into their profits. Also, again, that whole concept of buying a business from an aging baby boomer, involved in that thought process itself is a general assumption that there's value there because somebody has bought it, there's a customer base, and there's a reason why that person's getting out of it. I think you'll find that a lot of those businesses will just be shut down, not sold, because they just won't be perceived as being valuable. And I think there's places where you can see that already happening in different parts of America right now. The cost of carrying a business is oftentimes more than the value of the business that it can be producing. And you start to see it in areas like seasonal areas, right? A t-shirt shop at a beach resort, something like that. There could be scalability issues, and somebody's been doing it for 35 years and they're 68 years old, and they say, maybe I'll just shut it down. And there's going to be plenty of that. So you don't necessarily need to go buy something if it's not particularly valuable. Don't get duped into thinking it's valuable just because it exists.
That's a very good point. Yeah, we're not buying a Porta-John company then, boo.
No, I planned on it. Right now, of course, we're in the age of AI and robotics and open AI. I mean, you got Sam Altman, who, a few years back wrote a paper basically saying like AI and technology was going to advance so fast that every single American would be on UBI. And he was proposing $10,000 a year, which seems ridiculous. But because AI was so amazing, the cost of all goods and services would be almost zero. So $10,000 would actually be plentiful amount of money. Yeah. And yet I feel like we're at the point, like I said, I think, Elon Musk and Sam Altman, Bill Gates, Zuckerberg, they are really pumping this stuff because they want to, it's the early days of AI. They want to implement regulation so they can kind of lock in their monopoly, and they're overhyping this stuff. I tend to think a lot of this stuff is decades out. I mean, I use a lot of AI tools, and at first I was kind of really excited about it, but the more you use it, you realize that it has numerous limitations. So I think this stuff is decades out. Ultimately, the solution, like we had Mads Larson on, and the solution for the people that are more optimistic about the population decline, fertility decline, is that, well, just AI will solve all these issues. So, I mean, that's the question, right? Will AI just solve all these issues? Yeah, we have less people, but the people that we have are more productive because they're using these AI, whether assistants or, they're working in concert with robotics or et cetera. Is this what we can expect? We're not actually going to see a negative growth model because AI will enhance the population to such an extent?
That's a big question, right? And I think I'll start with answering it by saying it's a very convenient answer to be able to say, right? We've got such a large trend that's happening in modern society for the first time really ever, right? The bubonic plague would probably be a time that you could look at, but that's certainly not modern times. The suggestion that one thing can just fix something else in a simplistic manner, I think is just, it's too far of a reach. I think there's bound to be a whole lot of improvements to everyday stuff that happens as a result of AI and robotics. And it's probably going to be a lot more muddy and gritty than kind of somebody might suggest. Let me give you an example. I mentioned earlier in the conversation, I was at MIT judging this competition last week. And so this is a high-level class at MIT. It's a joint program between Harvard and MIT. And it's essentially a venture studio concept, right? So over the course of a semester, the students are tasked with coming up with a concept, a product or service and trying to make some traction happen on it, right? And then the idea is at some point, how do they do? And so these are some of the most talented people in the world on some of these topics. They're not 22-year-olds. They're oftentimes have already had a fellowship or some sort of business experience and things like that. So I'd say the average age was, say, something like 29 to 31 or something like that on average. So in the course of the last 3 or 4 years of this competition, this class, in the last few years, it used to be slideshows, PowerPoint deck, conceptual stuff, maybe some surveys being done by customer groups or whatnot. In all of these issues, in all these episodes, so there are 24 teams that presented to this group last week. The rate of change that is happening as a result of AI is astounding to me. And from a nuts and bolts business guy with interest and experience in a lot of different industries and sectors, I'm very encouraged, impressed, awed by the progress of things. And maybe Jesse, if you come to Boston, I'll walk up there to MIT with you and maybe change your point of view on some of that thought process. That I mentioned that we were talking about the plumber situation. So it was a DIY product to help fix appliances and do stuff. So in the matter of 4 months of a semester, this group came up with a concept, built a product, wrote the code, and is now in conversations right now with Home Depot to sell that product to be included in Home Depot's extended warranty packages and all their appliances. Now, that's just one small example. The efficiency and the productivity of things that can happen. The trial and error of things that happen in business, the attempts to do things, the feedback loops that have to happen. You come out with a widget, you try to improve the widget. Is there a marketplace for the widget? Yeah, Joe Blow guy is going to be willing to buy 1,000 of these widgets, but you got to reduce the price. How do you reduce the price? You got to go back to research and design. All the iterative approaches to common business applications is just enormously changing. And so there's power there. There's scalability, and it's not necessarily just going to be in a new Microsoft product. It's going to be utilized in manners in situations that the marketplace needs. At least that's where the opportunity is going to be driven to. You're going to have a whole bunch of things that aren't worthy of much, but the marketplace will figure that out. They'll kind of dissolve some things. Will AI and robotics solve this problem and prevent a negative GDP situation from happening? I have a hard time believing that to be the case. There's going to be struggles. There's going to be good stuff and bad stuff that's going to play out. There's going to be winners and losers. And there'll be cultural changes because certain countries and societies will do things at a different rate, a different pace. Borders will be redrawn. Companies will fail. Companies will succeed. So I think in the end, it's really more of a marketplace disruption that we've never seen before. And so the stakes are just now going to be higher. The successes are going to be more extreme. The failures are going to be more extreme as well. And there's going to probably be a lot more activity on both sides of that coin. Snapping your fingers and making somebody, 32 years old and productive in a society doesn't happen. And those conversations along UBI, I mean, I'm part of the TED circles, right? TED Talks and stuff like that. Been involved with TED for a little over 10 years, and I've had some of those conversations with folks, and again, based on assumptions that are just not grounded in truth, and the whole concept of everybody just sitting around doing nothing because everything is produced for free. there'd be a new Roman Empire or something like that would happen. You know, somebody would just gobble everything up and think that they would dominate. I don't know. It was a mouthful of an answer for you.
It's truly a good point. So I don't feel like it's so doom and gloom now, because it's as the need increases. Like, I mean, we're very capable human beings. Like, I mean, look at the stuff we built so far. So I think that solutions will definitely come into place as a need arises. But we will have those pains to obviously we'd have to go through them. And I think adjusting also if adjusting this conversation, like an adjusting culture has to adjust that this is a problem, a looming problem, and we need to, I don't know, I'd say make having babies great again. But I like what I mean, if you saw that at MIT, my mom works there, by the way, and
Wow, yeah.
those kids are incredibly, I mean, they're just some of the great minds. But I was wondering, I wonder if I dare go to this other avenue. But is it okay to ask about your thoughts on immigration and why I'm a bit torn by it? Is our borders open because of this problem? Did they open the borders because of this problem, or did they open the border? Like, I guess, like, do they know that we need to import all these people? Is that what they're trying to do? I guess it's okay if you don't want to go there, but
Yeah, I certainly don't have any issue talking about it at all. I think that the borders being open for purpose of bringing people into this country, I don't subscribe to that. I think it turned into a political topic that nobody really wanted to touch. It got worse, and now that there's going to be a reaction to it, that's probably equally dramatic. Your point, your question though on immigration overall, is a really good one, because if we have a shrinking labor force, there's no doubt that having a structure in place that brings people into the country is certainly helpful, productive, and important economically. That being the case, though, too, in America, it's so politically charged, and I think you'll see it changing more from, say, the investment or business community versus Washington, D.C. The complexities of the topic are pretty dramatic. Again, this is a global topic, right? Every country in the entire world is experiencing this trend one way or the other, just certain to degrees of significance. The concept of welcoming immigrants is certainly not a new one, and I think Charles Goodhart had some good points in your conversation with him. Societal changes and absorption of immigrants is kind of a separate conversation than the economic side of it. If they could be, if they can coexist in a functioning way, I think there's a recipe there that is going to be quite powerful. And I don't think it's going to be America. You look at what's going on with Canada. Canada's immigration policy is doing some pretty good things for them. They also have a bit of a misnomer that they can bring in as many people as they are and can, but nonetheless, they have a structure in place where they have requirements, and they let people in, and they bring people in from other parts of the world based on their needs, and that's something that's I think pretty effective. Several other countries across the world are doing something similar to that. In the end, though, you got to realize that if it's a global topic, then the true supply of immigrants that are going to move around are ultimately limited. And that brings us back to the question associated with Africa. And does Africa as a continent and in a collection of countries, do they have the wherewithal and the capabilities of organizing and harnessing the power of that labor force? That's a big one to tackle. Don't really know on that. When you look at other solutions associated with bringing people in and enticing immigration, I think the results are mixed. We already have a lot of that actually are happening right now. So in America, when COVID hit, we were already experiencing a dramatic shortage of nurses. There were tremendous jobs open for a long period of time going into COVID. And of course, when COVID hit, the nurses on the front lines, and it's an easy story to talk about, right? The protection that they needed and the long hours and the grinding and the unknowns, certainly a tough profession to be in. If you look at what's happened since then, though, a lot of nurses have retired as a result of COVID in America. Some took early retirement, and there's been now even more of a shortage of nurses in America. And America and Western Europe is already now absorbing most of the nurses across the world. Most of the nurses that are coming to market, if you will, in America, they're not from America. They're from other places, and a lot of them are from Africa. So you think that through a little bit. Why are they going to Western Europe and America? Because there's market opportunity there. They can get paid a lot of money. They can improve their lifestyle quite a bit. There's a trade-off there that an individual can make. I think you'll see that play out depending on the profession, the industry, and how likely that absorption can happen. Nurses, the whole medical space, everybody wants to help people. Everybody wants to feel good. There's certain rules and regulations you need to solve for. It's probably a little bit more difficult in other industries, manufacturing, carpentry, building. Other than basic general labor, it's hard to bring certain people in and absorb them. I would think that from a policy standpoint, America would be very well served to figure that out and to really come to grips with it. I'm not very optimistic on that, though, because I don't see the leaders really understanding the topic and as dire of a circumstance as it really is. And until that happens, I'm not so sure the conversations start, because the needs are already there. And they just got exemplified during COVID. We have sectors of our economy that have been very short in labor for a long, long time, and those sectors are trying to figure it out. But having a good immigration policy would definitely be wise. And I kind of look at it, and I talk about it in my book a little bit. But the conversations associated with immigration happens to be a lot of humanity, right? It's about we should let people come here if they want to come here, right? Regardless if they're refugees or just pursuing a different or better path in life. The general concept of being humane and America standing for what America does, we're a melting pot. We should be welcoming. We should bring people in. All of that is very positive in a very humane standpoint. It's not as warm and fuzzy to think about it this way, but I believe it's much more of an economic function now. It's more about the ability to actually produce something in absence of not being able to produce it at all. It's the ability to actually show forward progress and prevent a choke point from happening in your particular business. So the power of the economic side, I'm hopeful will turn into and help the humanity side of the whole conversation. There's no doubt, in my opinion, that we would be well served for it.
Yeah. I just haven't heard anyone talk about the integration or training of the trades. That was the word I was looking for, by the way. It's like trades and things, and training them to sort of integrate into society and become productive citizens of the United States and paying into taxes and paying to the system, right? Sort of contribute. I haven't heard anybody talk about a plan of this integration, and currently all I'm seeing, and maybe I'm, but all I'm seeing is just like there's this mass entry into the border, and they're occupying, what is it, 4 out of 5 hotels in New York, like four, and I'm just seeing this kind of overwhelm in the major cities with yet a plan on how to make it productive versus non-productive, I guess.
Yeah, it's obviously out of control, right? And lacks true oversight and management. And there's no doubt there's nobody really talking about it in that way. It has to be more strategically thought through, and again, the right people aren't having that conversation because it's not understood. Nobody understands that we don't have an abundance of labor. I mean, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, our government is projecting a workforce gain. It does not make any sense, and there's this disjointedness there. But that's government. That's bureaucracy, and it won't really come to the surface until it really needs to. And that's one of the benefits of, hopefully me writing a book about it, hopefully you guys discussing it and seeking out different other people that have interest in the conversation.
Do you have another book in the works on it?
I don't. I've got a few other things in the works. I think that it's really about bringing solutions to the marketplace. And if I do another book project, it'll probably be about more of the solutions. I certainly touch on the solutions in 2 or 3 of the chapters towards the end of my book. But it's hard to write about the rate of change when something is so dramatic. And to be honest with you too, I'm a Boston-based business guy, right? I have an economic lens through America. It's my experiences, my knowledge of industries and sectors is U.S. focused, and I think the solutions to some of the topics are outside of America. I'd probably want to spend some time in Eastern Europe. Africa is going to be a really interesting place. You got China almost colonizing parts of Africa. You've got Northern Africa is going through some, they're fighting over the water and the energy associated with it. You've got enormous gains of fintech, the blockchain component of coming out of Africa. You got subsistence farmers actually being able to have a business and conduct commerce with nothing but a simple mobile phone and get paid for it. It's just so dramatically different than the United States. And that's probably where I would want to put my direction towards. But I don't necessarily see myself doing that right now. There's plenty of business opportunity here that I'm trying to focus on and bring these topics to the surface.
Stepping back a little bit to when we were talking about kind of like AI and some of those robotic solutions. One, like if we're going forward, you always have to worry about like planned obsolescence where these companies are just going to input like, a software program, like, oh, you buy a new phone and then, 2 years later they have this software update that your phone can't handle, even though the phone is fine. So then you're forced to buy a new phone, or they do some subscription model where you don't really actually own it. You're just like constantly paying every month. You buy like a Tesla EV and you get the heated seats and all this stuff. And then you go to sell it. Then the next person, all that stuff is just wiped clean. They go back to the base model. The Bitcoin, I believe Bitcoin, just with the mining and all the electricity usage, like Bitcoin uses more electricity than the country of Argentina. And I think just to like mine it, it's something like if Bitcoin goes below $20,000 per Bitcoin, it's not even profitable for the miners because of all the electricity usage. We've heard a lot of reports about AI, about how like ChatGPT and Google Gemini, etc., they require so much electricity that it's just cheaper to have someone in Kenya making $2 an hour do the computations versus running these these algorithms through one of these advanced AI platforms. And of course, that doesn't include the fact that, people are trying to shut down, people don't want to do nuclear power anymore. They're trying to shut down, the power plants and go towards renewables or, quote unquote renewables. And so how are we going to actually power all these AI and Bitcoin and other blockchain assets? Then, like I mentioned, with planned obsolescence, let monopolists be monopolists, right? They're going to find a way to kind of like put you on a subscription model when they can. So I don't necessarily think that like we can't, go towards that future, but I think we have all these kind of like man-made, woman-made impediments to it.
Yeah, all good points, Jesse. And you're a well-read person. You got a good handle on a lot of those topics. I might suggest, though, that the implications of disruption in a large scale can be pretty powerful and dislodge a lot of that stuff. When the world needs a whole lot more power, somebody will figure out a way to make a whole lot more power. And it's probably not by putting more solar panels up. You know what I mean? It'll end up being some sort of molecular advancement that somebody comes up with or something like that. I guess my point is that changing the trajectory of development and process is just absolutely going to happen. And I think there's going to be a kind of just a scattering of all sorts of different things. You're going to have initiatives that are going to be made by scrappy entrepreneurs trying to figure out a way to make something work. You're going to have nefarious people in weird countries trying to take over the world. You're going to have advancements of technology that make something capable that nothing happened before. You'll have money exchanging hands and go in different directions. Companies succeeding and failing, and some countries might go away. I mean, a couple of your other podcasts, you talked about South Korea quite a bit. It's not all that strange of a thought to actually see entire societies get down to a smallest number where they actually just get absorbed. That means boundaries change. That means governments change. I know that's a lot to kind of consider, but it seems fairly likely that some things like that will play out. It just, somebody's going to say, "Hey, that looks like a good place to go," and maybe it's by force, and you get a little bit more like that Roman Empire type of thing. Maybe somebody goes and buys the most beautiful part of the Mediterranean because it's beautiful and affordable. So the massive disruption, I think, is going to be something that the marketplace hasn't seen in a long time, perhaps ever. And that's bound to be interesting, one way or the other, good, bad. Definitely going to be interesting.
It's interesting that you mentioned kind of like these boundaries, because to think like around World War I, there was about 50 countries in the whole world, and now in almost 2025 we're at around 200. But like, it's 50 countries. Like, people think of like all these various countries. I mean, in World War I or before World War II, is like you basically were a territory of France, or you're a territory of England, or a territory of one of these other countries. So like these boundaries, like, I mean, you're barely a century old, right? These boundaries can be redrawn, remapped, reshaped, etc.
And something that we really don't think about in this narrative is the concept of the financials, right? So countries have their own process of figuring out their rule of law, their leaders. Certain times people want to conquer and take over places and stuff like that. Introducing a narrative of financials can really change things. So a country could go just straight up bankrupt, right? Their debt is bigger than their assets, and somebody can just come in and buy it, absorb it. Now all of a sudden, then you start going down a path of debt, and the power of debt. You know, you were talking earlier about the size of the U.S. debt compared to GDP and stuff like that. And to a certain degree, debt is paper, right? In theory, it could be wiped out, right? There's certain things that could happen along those lines. Some of your other guests probably could speak more on that, but there's no doubt that change is likely to happen, and it's probably going to be less known than known of where it might come from, and I don't think we've seen something like that in a whole long time, and hopefully I have a tendency to look at it through an optimistic standpoint. I believe in solutions and the ability for people to rise to the occasion and overcome problems and solve problems with good market solutions. But you could take a doom and gloom point of view on it, and there's opportunities to conquer, I suppose. If you got the right resources and the right people, you could walk in and take over places. Certainly not my style, but who knows?
Public service announcement, please everyone, have more babies. Your life depends, or your kids' lives depend on it.
Yeah.
I think we need to start making movies that like create the dystopia, and sort of paint it and but fictionalize it. So that's basically how people connect with some of these topics, is if you turn it into some Hollywood movie, it's like, but this is really important.
So have you seen any of the propaganda that's come out, say from Eastern European countries or any of that stuff?
Oh, I can't say I have. Pray tell.
Yeah. Well, there was a campaign. It might have been the Netherlands. They did it a few years back. It was called "Do It for Mom."
Okay.
And literally, it was a public service announcement, and it was essentially enticing people to propagate, and it was a little racy. So you can look that up on your own. It's a little bit out of my circle.
Well, these days we get canceled if you tell people to go have children. So it's just like it's a whole thing.
The thing is that if you suggest that's a bad thing to say, then you've got to be willing and able to understand the repercussions of it, and that's where there's not a thorough understanding of the topic, and that's the reason why podcasts like this are good and helpful.
Heck yeah.
Today's guest has been Dustin Whitney, who has over 25 years experience as a business executive and entrepreneur, and is the author of the book Demographic Deception: Exposing the Overpopulation Myth and Building a Resilient Future. So Dustin, two final questions for you. One, just where can people find you, get a hold of you, that kind of information, find your book? And then secondly, leave us with a final thought related to this podcast or wherever you are thinking about today.
Amazon is definitely the place to buy my book. Easy to look up and reference. Demographic Deception is the title, as you said. DustinWhitney.com is a website of mine that people can learn more about me. Solutions and assistance is available. I am currently open to considerations of engagement in a variety of different ways, and projects and consulting and longer term relationships. So if it stokes anybody's interest, please reach out. Easy ways to get in contact with me through their website. And as final thoughts, I like how you guys are pulling on this topic and exploring it to a more thorough level. It's humbling to me to see and hear your interest in it, in the topic. You've, like you said earlier in the conversation, essentially anybody who's written or proposed thoughts on some of these topics you guys have interviewed, which also goes to suggest that there aren't that many of them. And so hopefully that circle can increase and the conversation can go further. I remain optimistic in outlook, and people do things when they feel good. And a lot of people haven't felt good in America for a long time. So maybe, Kai, when people change their outlook and they feel better, maybe people have a natural tendency to have more children. In the meantime, I think it's incredibly important to look around yourself on a daily basis, think about this topic, and there are signs all over the place. It doesn't matter what your role in life is or where you are geographically located. This topic is showing its face. Long-term labor shortages are going to be with us for a long time. And we're going to have to navigate through these waters. And certain things will be good, certain things will be not so good. But if we collectively have conversations like this, solutions will naturally emerge. So I genuinely appreciate your interest in the conversation, and I thank you for having me on.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.